back, everybody. This is Jeff McDonald and Learning Plan 13, The Truth and Denial of Genocide. We're going to look at recent attempts to deny the Holocaust, as well as denial of genocide in general. We're going to look at David Irving and some of his work, as well as the work of Deborah Lipstadt and her attempts to take on the Holocaust deniers. So let's continue with The Truth and Denial of Genocide. Quote by David Irving, "I say quite tastelessly, in fact, that more women died in the backseat of Edward Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than ever died in the gas chamber at Auschwitz." David Irving is probably the most famous of the Holocaust deniers. His work with the Institute of Historical Review has done the most in terms of Holocaust denial, and we're going to look at some of their quote-unquote scholarship and how they've become so famous, and their defeat recently in court with Deborah Lipstadt in terms of trying to deny that the Holocaust occurred. So what is Holocaust denial? What is genocide denial, and why does it happen? Occurs when an otherwise accepted act of genocide is met with attempts to deny the occurrence or minimize the scale of the death toll. And obviously Holocaust denial is the most well known. But this happens in virtually every genocide. If you go back to our earlier look at Stanton and the stages of genocide, denial was the last stage. So this does happen in genocides from Armenia, which we now see clearly the Armenian government denies that it occurred. We see it with Holocaust denial, and we also see it with more recent genocides in Asia. Minimize the extent of the genocidal event can be minimized, met with skepticism, like we said about the Armenian genocide, and is usually considered a form of what they call historical revisionism. They don't usually call it denial, but they say it's a different version or revision of history. Because genocide is so serious and world courts have historically held perpetrators responsible, there's always going to be this tendency to try to avoid divert blame with denial. And once again, according to Gregory Stanton's model, it's the 8th stage. Denial is the 8th stage that always follows the genocide, and this is from Stanton's work. It is among the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. The perpetrators of genocide dig up mass graves, they burn the bodies, try to cover up the evidence, and intimidate the witnesses. They deny that they committed the crimes and often blame what happened to the victims. The response to denial is punishment by an international tribunal or national courts. There is evidence is heard. The perpetrators are punished. Tribunals like the Yugoslav or Rwandan tribunals, or the tribunal to try the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, or the International Criminal Court may not deter the worst killers, but with the political and will to arrest and prosecute them, some may be brought to justice. And such courts may deter future potential genocidists who can never again share Hitler's expectation of impunity when he sneered, "Who after all remembers the Armenians?" And remember that quote from earlier on in our course, because Hitler figured that people would refer to the genocide of the Jews the same way they referred to the genocide of the Armenians, which is, who even remembers it? Luckily, we have learned from that to some degree, and we now actively prosecute people who are responsible for crimes against humanity. Holocaust denial is a propaganda movement active in the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, seeks to deny the reality of the Nazi regime's systematic murder of 6 million Jews in Europe during World War II. It generally depicts historical accounts of the genocide as propaganda generated by the Jewish or Zionist conspiracy. Because people say, why would people even want to deny this? Well, these are people clearly that are trying to minimize what happened to the Jews because they don't want sympathy for the Jews, and they believe the Holocaust deniers will try to make people believe that the Holocaust is a myth, is propaganda that's been perpetuated by the Jews or by what they call some Zionist conspiracy to get a homeland, and so they came up with this idea, this hoax, this lie, as the book there talks about, to basically gain sympathy for the Jews and to give them credibility in order to establish a homeland. Roots of Holocaust denial, or Holocaust revisionism, and its followers refer to the movement, can be found in the language of the Nazis themselves. If we remember, they always tried to hide what they were doing. They tried to use all those euphemisms like resettlement, deportation, final solution, rather than try to say mass murder, extermination, slave labor. They would use different words, and so it even begins to be denied during the act itself. It's kind of interesting. After World War II, former Nazis and their supporters likewise claimed that Hitler's hatred of the Jews had been exaggerated. and there are numerous confessions of Nazi leaders describing genocide had been coerced by the Allies. So trying to say that the stuff that came out during the trials that dealt with the crimes of the Holocaust were basically attempts by this government and the government of the other Allies to coerce the Nazis themselves to make those statements. It dismisses the testimony of survivors, both the Jewish survivors of the camps and the liberators, basically being exaggeration and lies. One of the classic examples that they say, or quotes that they say, is that they know that the testimonies of the survivors and the testimonies of the liberators of the camps are a lie because they're all so similar, and that's how they know that they're lies. And if you listen to that, the logic of that, it makes no sense, because typically what qualifies as truth is several different people stating it the same way. But see, in their mind, that shows that it's a lie. There are 5 arguments that the deniers make about the Holocaust. The first one is that the Holocaust did not occur because there is no single master plan for Jewish annihilation. They're basically looking for something. They're looking for some single document that says, okay, here we go. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And they want it to be signed by Hitler, basically, that this is the order to exterminate the Jews. And there is no single document that says that. We know from the Wannsee Conference and the Wannsee Protocol that there were plans made and their plans were laid out, that the decision had already been made, but Hitler's name appears nowhere on there in terms of a signature or a direct order. Most of what Hitler did, being at the top of a criminal conspiracy, he was smart enough to not pin his name to everything, and so did it as per Führer's orders, as they call it. And this would be handed down to people like Eichmann, like Heydrich, who would then say, based on the will of the Führer, this is what we want to do, this is what we are going to do, and this is how we are going to do it. But because there's no plan that says, dear everybody, kill the Jews, love Adolf, then the Holocaust deniers say, well, that didn't occur. They say there were no gas chambers used for mass murder at Auschwitz and other camps. They say that those gas chambers were used to fumigate clothing. Now, we know that that's not true because of the size of these gas chambers, and because of the residue that was in the gas chambers, and because of the evidence that was left behind the gas chambers. But because there are no, because of the lack of testimony by witnesses, we do have some. We have the Sonderkommandos, the Jews that actually did the work there, so we know that that happened. But because there are so few of them left, and credible witnesses to say, okay, this is what happened in these chambers and this is how people died. As the people die off, as they get old now, they can come out and say, well, these gas chambers were used for fumigating clothing. They were not used for killing human beings. Holocaust scholars rely the testimony of survivors because there's no objective documentation proving the Nazi genocide. Whatever they qualify as objective documentation is really hard to define, because survivor testimony is part of that documentation, but so is all the thousands and thousands of pages of documentation that we got from the Nazi archives themselves. But Holocaust deniers say that it's not objective because it was coerced by the Allies after the war. There was no net loss of Jewish lives between 1941 and 1945. This is a ridiculous claim, because how would they know that? They're arguing that how can we count the loss of 6 million Jews? Because they want documentation that these lives were destroyed, that these people were destroyed, and that people actually died. They are not able to document that because there were so many people that ultimately escaped, changed names, changed documentation, and disappeared into Europe. And so they argued that there was no net loss of life, of Jewish lives, between these years. We know that that's not true. We know that these people that died, and we know that because of the evidence that was left behind, because of the documentation, and because they no longer exist. Did some change their names and move to Palestine and some other places and alter their papers so that it seemed like Joe Smith died and now he has taken a new identity as John Jones? Absolutely. We know that that happened in many cases, but it didn't happen to 6 million people. But this is part of their argument. They said the Nuremberg trials were a farce of justice staged for the benefit of Jews, that there was no real intention to punish war criminals, that basically it was there just to make a point for the Jewish state. Once again, if that was necessarily true, then why were so many of the people that were put on trial at Nuremberg spared, found innocent, and served lighter sentences? So once again, it's a silly claim. An organized movement begins in 1979 with the founding of a group called the Institute of Historical Review, the IHR. Willis Carto was the founder, publishes a magazine, the Journal of Historical Review, holds conferences, distributes a variety of anti-Jewish books, all devoted to the idea that Hitler's record of atrocities is a fraud, concocted by a powerful secret conspiracy of Jews. And they have what's called the 66 Questions, and it's basically a documentation that goes through some of the arguments that the Holocaust did not occur. And once again, it's kind of a ridiculous piece of propaganda, but this is how they are able to convince people who are not real familiar with the Holocaust itself that the Holocaust didn't happen. If you go to a website called Nizkor, Nizkor, .org, they go through the 66 questions, and I think there's a link in your learning plan for this time that goes to that website and kind of shows you some of those classic arguments. I'm looking real quick for my shortened copy of it, but they'll say things like, how do we know this happened? Because even sometimes the people who liberated the camps, when they came back, they said that Dachau was a death camp, and we know that Dachau wasn't a death camp. Why would they say that? They would say that Zyklon B was used as a pesticide. It wasn't used to kill people. And yes, Zyklon B was a pesticide. But that's how they decided, and that's how they figured out that it can be used to kill people, because people that were using it died accidentally, and ultimately they said, well, this is a cheaper way of killing people. So there's a lot of questions that they try to trick people who don't know a lot about the Holocaust into believing that the Holocaust did not occur. It's a great website to check out. The Institute of Historical Review is a pseudo-academic enterprise which professors with no credentials in history write revised accounts of Holocaust history. Some of the more famous people that are associated with this group: Arthur Butz, who's an electrical engineering professor at Northwestern University, and this is a copy of his book, The Hoax of the 20th Century. David Irving, who we talked a little bit about and we'll talk some more about, British historian without formal academic certification. Bradley Smith, Committee for Open Debate on the Holocaust. He basically comes around nowadays to college campuses to try to talk to people, college students, about the Holocaust and about denial of the Holocaust. So questions to think about. How do we know history? What are some of the things that you, in your mind, when you try to decide what is history, how do you know that? What are some of the criteria that you use? And what qualifies as proof that something in the past happened? If it's already happened, how do we know that it happened? And how does that relate to the Holocaust? So take a couple minutes, think about those questions, and then come back to the presentation. Deborah Lipstadt is a professor at Emory University, and in 1993 she publishes a book called Denying the Holocaust: A Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. Her goal was to basically expose the lies, distortions, and political agendas that are behind the people that deny the Holocaust. And in her book, she discussed a number of specific deniers, specific authors, including David Irving, and she calls him a dangerous spokesperson for Holocaust denial. David Irving then sues Dr. Lipstadt and Penguin Books for libel in 1996 because he claimed that her accusations in the book against him hurt his reputation. And so he sues her in British court for libel in 1996. Things are a little bit different in terms of the law in Great Britain. American law places the burden on the proof on the accuser. To win, Irving would have had to prove that Lipstadt lied about him in her book, and that would need to prove that Lipstadt wrote about him with malice. But in England, the laws are a little bit different. It placed the burden of proof on Deborah Lipstadt herself, the defendant. By suing Lipstadt in his own country, Irving forced her to prove that her statements about him were truthful. So she had to prove that what she said was true, that he was in fact a Holocaust denier, that he knew the Holocaust occurred, but twisted history to basically prove his point, and that he deliberately wrote untrue things about the Holocaust. Excuse me. One of the things that Irving uses in his Holocaust denial claims is called the Leuchter Report. The Leuchter Report is based on the work of Fred Leuchter. He is a self-proclaimed execution expert that was hired by Ernst Zundel, who himself was being tried in Canada for publishing works of Holocaust denial. Leuchter was hired to investigate and testify as an expert witness at his trial. He was paid $35,000 to do that. He travels to Auschwitz and Birkenau to examine the structures that were identified as gas chambers, and Leuchter concludes that they could not have been used for mass murder. If you look on the internet, there's a video of his testimony in terms of his work, his experiment to determine this. The Leuchter report was a sham, basically. He has no real credentials to do this, and what he did in the gas chambers, or the former gas chambers, because they're basically rubble now, did not prove at all what he said that they proved, and his experimental methods were flawed. Before being brought to trial on criminal charges of practicing engineering without a license, Leuchter signed a consent agreement on June 12, 1991, admitting that he had misrepresented himself as an engineer, both in letters and proposals to correctional facilities, and in his report on the concentration camp gas chambers. So ultimately, he, after being brought on charges, he admits that he did not know what he was doing and didn't have the credentials to do that. It was pretty clear when you look at the video of him doing it that he didn't realize what he was doing. One of the things that Leuchter found in his examinations of the gas chambers was that there were two different types of chambers. There was one chamber that was used to exterminate people, and there was another chamber that was used to fumigate clothing. And when Leuchter went into these gas chambers, he did some tests on the concrete. He took out samples of concrete from the walls, and he measured the amount of Cyclone B residue that was left on them. And what he found was that the residue on the walls of the chambers that were used to fumigate clothing was higher than the residue of the Cyclone B that was on the walls of the chambers to exterminate people. And in his mind, that proved that those could not have been used to kill people. If the residue was higher in the clothing chambers than it was in the people extermination chambers, then the people chambers could not have been used to kill people. And that was his conclusion. Now, when you think about that for a minute, you realize he had it totally backwards. Because in the chambers that were used to fumigate clothing, there would be a higher degree, a higher residue amount on the walls of Cyclone B, because the Cyclone B would not have been breathed in by human beings. It would have been left as residue on the clothing and on the walls. In the extermination chambers, the residue would have been less on the walls because most of the Cyclone B was absorbed into people's lungs, and they were taken out of those chambers and then burnt. The bodies were destroyed. So that the residue would have been less on the chambers where the people were. But see, because of his lack of training as an experimental engineer, he did not have that training to do that. Holocaust goes on trial from January 11th through March 15th. This is that libel trial. Irving ends up representing himself. Ruling for Lipstadt and the publishers, the chief judge argued that it was incontrovertible that Irving qualifies as a Holocaust denier. He did very little to prove his point. Lipstadt was able to prove that, in fact, he did deny the Holocaust by using the evidence that he used. He describes Irving as an anti-Semite, explained that Irving's words are directed against Jews, either individually or collectively, in the sense that they are by turns hostile, critical, offensive, and derisory in their references to Semitic people, their characteristics, and their appearances. So that's his agenda. He's an anti-Semite. He identifies a lot of different Nazi groups or neo-Nazi groups, and ultimately that's what's his agenda. Consistent with British libel law, Irving was ordered to pay the legal fees incurred by the defense, which amounted to nearly £2 million, which ultimately destroys him economically. So what are some motivations of Holocaust denial? People like Irving, one of them is conspiracy theory. They believe that all this is a conspiracy, that everybody's in on it, that all the people like myself that teach this, all the survivors, all the liberators, everybody's in on it. Well, that's ridiculous. How could that many people hide something this monumental for so long? It's impossible. Another motivation is they're anti-Semitic. They don't want to. They don't like the Jews, and they believe that the Holocaust victimizes the Jews, and so they don't want that. They want to show the negativity of the Jews, and so that they believe that the stuff that happened in the Holocaust does exactly the opposite of that. They are against sympathy for Israel. It is clear that the Holocaust itself created the path for Israel to become a nation. Because of their lack of a homeland, because of being dispersed throughout Europe of the Holocaust and the death of so many people, it became very clear to the international community that the Jews needed a safe religious homeland for themselves. And Israel was created because of that. Ultimately, this denial of the Holocaust is embedded in that hatred of Israel and against the sympathy for Israel. A lot of Holocaust denial comes down to admiration for not the Nazis and Hitler, which to me kind of confuses the situation, because you would think if these people really admired the Nazis and what Hitler did, they would actually try to celebrate the Holocaust, as weird as that sounds. They wouldn't try to deny what the Nazis and Hitler did during the Holocaust. But because they know the Nazis and Hitler are seen so negative today, so they're trying to make them look better by minimizing their crimes. And another thing is to clear Germany's name. Germany bears a lot of guilt today for the Holocaust. Right or wrong, they suffer with that. And they believe if they minimize the effects of this Holocaust, they minimize or deny that the Holocaust occurred, then in fact they can clear Germany's name and make Germany a more stronger nation. When you know people from Germany, or you look at the education of Germany today, they are very aware of what happened, and they teach their children about what happened. And they do not deny that the Holocaust happened. In fact, they learn from that so that it does not happen again. But once again, there are certain people that still have this in their head, that if we try to get rid of it, then it will clear the name, it will clear the blame for Germany. So I guess I want you to think a little bit about why you think that people deny the Holocaust. It seems so silly to deny something that's so well documented, photographed, so much testimony that we have, so many books that have been written, museums that have been created about it, yet there's still people that deny the Holocaust. And relatively intelligent people, well-educated people, deny that the Holocaust happened. So think for a minute why you think that happened. To me, this is probably the strongest argument to making sure people know that the Holocaust happened. Primo Levi, 1983, those who deny Auschwitz would be ready to remake it. The more people forget that this happened, the easier it is that it happens again. And that's not what we want. We want people to be educated so that this kind of genocide never again occurs. That's it for Learning Plan 13. For your assignment this week, you're looking at some of the reasons to study the Holocaust and understand genocide. I want you to kind of go through the epilogue and look at some of the reasons that different authors have posed in terms of what contributes to genocide, and this idea that if we try to understand genocide, does it excuse the perpetrators? So take a look at that assignment. For Tolerance and Inhumanity, I'm Jeff McDonald. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.